From secret peepholes in Hollywood bathrooms to injecting oranges with vodka on set, from stealing John Barrymore's corpse for a midnight prank to working as a sheep castrator in his youth, Errol Flynn's real life made his swashbuckling movies seem tame by comparison. Here are 15 things you never knew about Errol Flynn. Fact 1. The Peeping Tom's Paradise. When Errol Flynn built his dream home on Mulholland Drive in 1941, he didn't just create a mansion, he engineered what was essentially a voyeur's paradise disguised as a sophisticated Hollywood estate. Flynn spent years designing every detail of what he officially called Mulholland Farm, but privately referred to as his playhouse. And the name was more appropriate than most guests realized. The seemingly elegant colonial-style ranch house contained an elaborate network of secret passageways that allowed Flynn to move unseen throughout the property. But the most shocking features were the two-way mirrors he installed in multiple bathrooms, which appeared as regular mirrors to unsuspecting female guests, but functioned as windows for Flynn and his friends to spy on women as they changed into bathing suits or used the shower facilities. Flynn also constructed viewing tubes that worked like reverse periscopes, allowing him to look down from the second floor to see who was entering the house. One particularly elaborate setup involved a crawl space above a bedroom that was accessible through an upstairs room, giving Flynn a perfect view of the bed below through another strategically placed two-way mirror. The system was so extensive that Flynn would routinely tell arriving starlets and leading ladies to go change in specific rooms, then quickly excuse himself to rush upstairs and watch through his hidden viewing spots. Hollywood insiders knew about Flynn's mirrors and peepholes, making them what one author called the worst-kept secret in Hollywood. But the general public remained unaware of the mansion's true purpose. Flynn even went beyond visual spying by installing hidden microphones connected to his den, allowing him and his drinking buddies to eavesdrop on private conversations between female guests. The entire setup turned what appeared to be an elegant Hollywood home into an elaborate surveillance operation designed to satisfy Flynn's voyeuristic obsessions. Fact 2. Vodka. Injected orange smuggler. By the early 1950s, Errol Flynn's drinking problem had become so severe that movie studios began implementing strict no-alcohol policies on their film sets, but Flynn's addiction led him to devise one of Hollywood's most creative workarounds. When Universal Studios banned all alcohol during the filming of Against All Flags in 1952, Flynn responded with a scheme that sounds almost too bizarre to be true. Flynn began arriving on set each morning carrying what appeared to be a perfectly innocent bag of fresh oranges, which he would snack on throughout the day like any health-conscious actor might do. However, his co-star Maureen O'Hara and the film crew gradually noticed that Flynn's behavior followed a predictable pattern. He would show up, prepared and professional, with all his lines memorized, but by 4 in the afternoon, he would be noticeably drunk. The mystery was solved when Flynn later confessed in his autobiography that he had been using a syringe to inject pure vodka directly into the oranges, creating what was essentially alcoholic fruit that could pass casual inspection. The technique allowed him to consume significant amounts of alcohol throughout the filming day while appearing to maintain a healthy diet. And the natural sugars in the orange juice helped mask the harsh taste of the vodka. This orange injection method became Flynn's go-to solution whenever studios tried to control his drinking, and he used variations of this technique on multiple film sets throughout his later career. The fact that he went to such elaborate lengths to smuggle alcohol onto movie sets demonstrates just how severe his addiction had become, but it also shows the kind of creative problem-solving that Flynn applied to getting around rules he didn't want to follow. Despite the bizarre circumstances surrounding the filming, Against All Flags surprisingly became a box office hit, proving that Flynn could still deliver entertaining performances even while maintaining his secret orange-based drinking system. Fact 3. Expelled from every school. Errol Flynn holds what might be the most impressive academic failure record in Hollywood history. He was expelled from literally every single school he ever attended, creating a pattern of educational disasters that started in childhood and continued well into his teens. Flynn's father, Theodore Thompson Flynn, was a respected marine biologist and university professor who had the connections and resources to get his son enrolled in some of the finest educational institutions in Australia and England, but young Errol's rebellious nature made him completely incompatible with traditional schooling. The expulsions began early in Tasmania, where Flynn attended multiple schools including the Hutchins School, Hobart College, the Friends School, and Albuera Street Primary School. Getting kicked out of each one for various offenses, ranging from truancy and fighting to general troublemaking. When his family moved to England, Flynn's educational disasters continued at Southwestern London College in Barnes, where he managed to get himself expelled yet again. One of the most scandalous expulsions occurred when Flynn was caught in a sexual encounter with the school laundress's daughter, an incident that not only got him kicked out, but also established the pattern of romantic trouble that would follow him throughout his life. Other expulsions involved Flynn getting into fights with other students over girls, stealing money from classmates, and generally being what school administrators described as an uncontrollable bully who disrupted the educational environment. Back in Australia, Flynn's final attempt at formal education ended when he was expelled from Sydney Church of England Grammar School, also known as Shore. At this point, his exasperated father essentially gave up on traditional schooling, and Flynn was forced to find work as a junior clerk with a Sydney shipping company, though he was quickly fired from that job as well for stealing petty cash. This complete educational failure record meant that Flynn entered adulthood with virtually no formal qualifications, forcing him to rely on his charm, good looks, and willingness to take on unusual jobs. Fact 4. Professional sheep castrator. Among the many bizarre jobs that Errol Flynn worked before finding fame in Hollywood, perhaps none was more shocking than his time as a professional sheep castrator on an Australian ranch, where he learned a technique so crude and disturbing that it sounds like something from a different century. After his string of expulsions from every school he attended, Flynn was desperate for work and ended up on a sheep station where he quickly discovered that being the newest employee meant getting assigned the most unpleasant tasks available. Flynn later described this experience in vivid detail in his autobiography, explaining that as the low man on the ranch hierarchy, he was assigned to what he called the bottom of the sheep itself. The castration process involved no modern tools or veterinary techniques. Instead, Flynn and the other workers used their teeth to bite through the scrotum and remove the testicles, then spit out what Flynn described as tasting like a couple of olives. The technique was apparently common practice on Australian sheep ranches at the time, with Flynn noting that the sheep never made a sound during the procedure and that he would consume his daily proportion of oysters. As the workers grimly referred to their quota of sheep testicles, Flynn wrote that bluebottle flies would swarm all over him during this work, making the already unpleasant job even more disgusting. This particular employment arrangement came to an abrupt end, not because of the revolting nature of the work, but because Flynn was caught in bed with the ranch owner's daughter, forcing him to flee the property quickly to avoid the angry father's wrath. The experience on the sheep ranch was just one of many odd jobs Flynn worked during his wandering years in Australia and New Guinea, which also included stints as a police constable, sanitation engineer, treasure hunter, and shipmaster for hire. But the sheep castration job remains the most memorably grotesque of his pre-Hollywood career choices. Fact 5. John Barrymore's corpse prank. One of the most macabre pranks in Hollywood history allegedly occurred in May 1942, when legendary actor John Barrymore died, and his drinking buddies decided to give him one final send-off that would become the stuff of Hollywood legend. Flynn had been devastated by the death of his mentor and close friend John Barrymore, who had been part of a wild group known as the Bundy Drive Boys that included Flynn, director Raoul Walsh, and several other Hollywood figures famous for their heavy drinking and outrageous behavior. According to Flynn's own account in his autobiography, Walsh approached the undertaker at Pierce Brothers mortuary with a sob story about Barrymore's elderly, housebound aunt who desperately wanted one final look at her beloved nephew before the funeral. Walsh sweetened the deal with a $200 bribe, convincing the mortician to release Barrymore's body for just 1 hour, and then he and his accomplices transported the corpse to Flynn's Mulholland Drive mansion. The pranksters carefully positioned Barrymore's pale, lifeless body in Flynn's favorite chair, arranged everything to look natural, and then turned off all the lights before Flynn returned home from a night of drinking. When Flynn walked into his living room and flicked on the light switch, he found himself face to face with his dead friend's corpse, complete with what Flynn described as a puffed, white, bloodless appearance since the body hadn't been embalmed yet. Flynn let out what he called a delirious scream and immediately ran out of his own house, making it as far as the front porch before Walsh and the other conspirators caught up with him to explain that it was all just an elaborate practical joke. They quickly returned Barrymore's body to the funeral home, while Flynn spent the rest of the night shaken and sleepless, later writing that it was no way to remember the passing of John Barrymore, though some historians question whether this outrageous story actually happened. Fact 6. the body of a 75-year-old, when Errol Flynn collapsed and died of a massive heart attack in Vancouver, Canada on October 14, 1959, the world lost a movie star who was only 50 years old. But the autopsy results revealed the shocking extent to which his legendary lifestyle of excess had destroyed his body from the inside out. The medical examination showed that Flynn's internal organs had deteriorated so severely that doctors concluded he had the physical condition of a man who was 75 years old, meaning his body had aged an extra 25 years beyond his actual age. The most devastating damage was found in Flynn's liver, which had been so completely destroyed by decades of heavy drinking that the examining physicians determined he could have survived for only 9 to 12 more months, even if the heart attack hadn't killed him. This meant that Flynn was essentially living on borrowed time during his final year, when he was traveling around Cuba making his pro-Castro films and spending time with his teenage girlfriend Beverly Adland. The autopsy also revealed a catalog of other serious health problems that had been plaguing Flynn for years, including chronic tuberculosis that he had contracted during his time in New Guinea, recurrent malaria, chronic back pain for which he had been taking morphine and later heroin, and no fewer than 6 separate sexually transmitted diseases that were linked to his claim of having slept with 10,000 women during his lifetime. Flynn had been taking regular morphine injections for his back pain, which had eventually led to a serious heroin addiction that further compromised his already failing health. The medical report painted a picture of a man whose body had been systematically destroyed by alcohol, drugs, disease, and the kind of reckless living that had made him famous, showing that his swashbuckling screen persona had come at an enormous physical cost that ultimately cut his life short by decades. Fact 7. Treasure hunter and diamond smuggler. Before Errol Flynn became Hollywood's most famous swashbuckler, he was living out his own real-life adventures in the remote wilderness of New Guinea, where he worked a series of increasingly questionable jobs that included diamond smuggling, treasure hunting, and eventually outright theft to finance his escape from the tropical colony. Flynn had arrived in New Guinea at age 18 after his string of school expulsions, initially hoping to strike it rich in the gold fields, but he quickly discovered that legitimate mining work was both difficult and unprofitable for someone with his restless temperament. Flynn's time in New Guinea became a catalog of dubious enterprises that would have made excellent material for his later adventure films, as he worked as everything from a plantation overseer to a boat captain, despite having no real sailing experience. Among his more colorful occupations was his work as a diamond smuggler, helping to transport precious stones through the dangerous jungle terrain while avoiding colonial authorities who were trying to regulate the gem trade in the region. When Flynn finally decided to leave New Guinea and pursue his dreams of becoming an actor in England, he was completely broke and desperate for travel money, which led him to commit what was essentially an armed robbery without the weapon. Flynn stole a handful of precious gems from a female acquaintance, providing him with the funds he needed to make the 14,000-kilometer journey from New Guinea to London. During this epic journey to England, Flynn met a Dutch doctor who shared his love of debauchery and questionable ethics, and the two men proceeded to cheat and scam their way through most of Asia, using various cons and schemes to pay for their passage while avoiding law enforcement. Flynn's willingness to steal from a woman who trusted him, combined with his international crime spree across multiple countries, shows just how far he was willing to go to escape his circumstances and chase his Hollywood dreams. Fact 8. Castro's only American journalist. In one of the most remarkable coincidences in modern history, Errol Flynn happened to be the only American journalist present with Fidel Castro on the night of January 1, 1959, when Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista secretly fled the country, making Flynn an accidental witness to one of the most pivotal moments of the Cuban Revolution. Flynn had traveled to Cuba in late 1958 not as a serious war correspondent, but rather as a washed-up movie star looking for material to write articles for the New York Journal-American and other publications, hoping to capitalize on the growing international interest in Castro's rebel movement. Flynn had developed an unlikely friendship with the young revolutionary leader during his time in Cuba, spending many days with Castro in the mountains, and becoming genuinely impressed with what he saw as Castro's idealistic vision for overthrowing the corrupt Batista regime. On that historic New Year's Eve, Flynn was with Castro and his inner circle when news arrived at 3 a.m. that Batista had abandoned his presidential palace and fled Cuba with his family and closest supporters, effectively ending his dictatorship and clearing the way for Castro's complete victory. This meant that Flynn became the sole American eyewitness to Castro's reaction, when he learned that the revolution had succeeded, and Flynn was able to document the moment when Castro realized he would soon become the leader of Cuba. Flynn later wrote detailed accounts of this historic night, describing Castro's mixture of triumph and the enormous responsibility he suddenly faced as the new ruler of an entire nation. The articles Flynn wrote about this experience and his other adventures with Castro's rebel forces remained unpublished and were actually lost for decades until they were rediscovered in 2009 in a collection at the University of Texas at Austin. Flynn's unique position as Castro's American drinking buddy gave him access to revolutionary history that no other Western journalist experienced firsthand during this crucial period. Fact 9. His house was literally haunted. After Errol Flynn's death in 1959, Mulholland Farm became the center of one of Hollywood's most well-documented ghost stories, with multiple families reporting supernatural encounters that seemed to involve Flynn's restless spirit refusing to leave his beloved home. The first family to experience unexplained phenomena was the Hamblins, led by Christian singer and songwriter Stuart Hamblin, who purchased the property from Flynn's estate and lived there for 20 years, while strange incidents occurred regularly throughout the house. When rock and roll legend Ricky Nelson bought Mulholland Farm in 1980, the paranormal activity became even more pronounced and disturbing for his family members. Nelson's daughter Tracy experienced the most frightening encounters, often feeling an invisible presence in the house when she was alone, and sometimes hearing what sounded like violent altercations coming from other rooms, complete with the sounds of glass breaking and furniture being smashed against walls. The most chilling part of these incidents was that when Tracy would investigate the source of these crashes the next morning, she would find that nothing in the house had been disturbed or damaged, suggesting that the sounds were coming from some kind of supernatural replay of Flynn's wild parties from decades earlier. When Tracy told her father about these terrifying experiences, Ricky Nelson would simply respond with, "Oh, that's only Errol," showing that the family had come to accept Flynn's ghost as a permanent resident of the property. The supernatural encounters reached their peak when Nelson's son Gunnar claimed to have actually seen Flynn's ghostly reflection appearing in one of the house's many mirrors, the same mirrors that Flynn had used during his lifetime to spy on female guests. Tracy later believed that Flynn's ghost had been trying to warn the family about impending disaster, since the paranormal activity seemed to intensify just before Ricky Nelson died in a plane crash in 1985, as if Flynn was attempting to protect the family that had been living in his former home. Fact 10. Failed physical for WW2. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, Errol Flynn attempted to enlist in the armed services like many other Hollywood stars, but he failed his military physical examination so spectacularly that it revealed just how severely his adventurous lifestyle had damaged his health, though Warner Brothers Studios worked hard to keep the embarrassing medical details secret from the public. Flynn's physical examination uncovered a catalog of serious health problems that made him completely unfit for military service, starting with recurrent malaria that he had contracted during his years working in the jungles of New Guinea. The military doctors also discovered that Flynn had a heart murmur, which was particularly ironic, given that he was famous for playing athletic, sword-fighting heroes who performed incredible physical feats on screen. Even more shocking was the revelation that Flynn was suffering from latent pulmonary tuberculosis, a potentially fatal lung disease that could have been spread to other soldiers if he had been allowed to serve in close quarters with military units. Perhaps most embarrassing of all were the multiple venereal diseases that Flynn had contracted over the years, which the examining physicians documented as part of his comprehensive medical failure. These sexually transmitted infections were directly related to Flynn's boastful claims about sleeping with thousands of women throughout his adult life, but they also made him a serious health risk to any military unit he might have joined. Warner Brothers Studios was desperate to protect Flynn's heroic screen image and worked overtime to keep the real reasons for his military rejection completely confidential, instead allowing the press and public to believe that Flynn was simply avoiding service or didn't care about the war effort. This led to widespread criticism of Flynn as a draft dodger and damaged his reputation significantly, even though the truth was that he was physically incapable of serving due to the accumulated health problems from his years of reckless living in exotic locations around the world. 11. His final film with underage girlfriend. Errol Flynn's final movie was a bizarre and controversial project called Cuban Rebel Girls. Released in 1959, which served as both his last desperate attempt to revive his failing career and a starring vehicle for his 17-year-old girlfriend Beverly Adland, whom he had met when she was just 15 years old at the Hollywood Professional School. The film was essentially pro-Castro propaganda that Flynn wrote, produced, and starred in during the actual Cuban Revolution, with Flynn playing himself as a war correspondent who helps American volunteers join Fidel Castro's rebel forces against the Batista government. Flynn cast the teenage Adland as one of the titular rebel girls, despite the fact that she had virtually no acting experience and delivered what critics described as one of the worst performances ever captured on film, reading her lines with no conviction and coming across as what one reviewer called a super dumb valley girl. The 68-minute film was shot with Castro's full cooperation while he was still fighting Batista's forces, giving it an unusual documentary quality mixed with Flynn's fictional narrative about young American women joining the revolutionary cause. The movie served multiple purposes for Flynn beyond simply showcasing his young girlfriend's limited talents, as it also functioned as a tax write-off for his mounting financial problems and allowed him to capitalize on his genuine friendship with Castro and his enthusiasm for the Cuban Revolution. Flynn had become a sincere supporter of Castro's movement after spending time with the rebels in the mountains, viewing Castro as an idealistic leader fighting against a corrupt dictatorship. Critics universally panned Cuban Rebel Girls as a sad ending to Flynn's once glorious career, with most reviews focusing on how far the former swashbuckling star had fallen rather than the film's political message. The project highlighted Flynn's desperate personal and financial circumstances in his final year, as he was simultaneously dealing with serious health problems, mounting debts, and a controversial relationship that kept him in the tabloids for all the wrong reasons. Fact 12. Son vanished in Cambodia. Errol Flynn's only son, Sean Flynn, inherited his father's adventurous spirit but channeled it into war photography rather than acting, ultimately disappearing in Cambodia on April 6, 1970, while covering the Vietnam War as a freelance photojournalist for Time magazine. Sean had briefly tried following in his father's footsteps as an actor, even appearing in a sequel to his father's famous Captain Blood, called Son of Captain Blood in 1962, but he found acting unfulfilling and decided to pursue the much more dangerous career of combat journalism. Sean Flynn quickly gained a reputation as one of the most fearless war correspondents in Southeast Asia, regularly traveling with U.S. Army Special Forces units and irregular fighters operating in the most remote and dangerous areas of the conflict zone. His quest for exceptional photographs led him to take enormous risks that other journalists avoided, often venturing deep into hostile territory where few Western reporters dared to go. On that fateful day in April 1970, Sean Flynn and his colleague Dana Stone were following a U.S. Army invasion into Cambodia when they were captured by communist guerrillas, most likely members of the Khmer Rouge. Neither man was ever seen or heard from again, despite extensive search efforts that continued for more than a decade and were largely financed by Sean's mother, Lily Demita, Flynn's first wife. The disappearance became one of the most famous unsolved mysteries of the Vietnam War era, and Sean was officially declared dead in 1984 after 14 years of fruitless searching. Most experts believe that Sean and Dana Stone were executed shortly after their capture, though their bodies were never recovered or identified. Sean's story inspired the 1981 song Sean Flynn by the British punk band The Clash, and his life and disappearance were later documented in the book Inherited Risk: Errol and Sean Flynn in Hollywood and Vietnam, which explored the tragic parallel between father and son's dangerous lifestyles. Fact 13. Microphones in the bathroom. Errol Flynn's voyeuristic obsession at Mulholland Farm went far beyond the secret peepholes and two-way mirrors that allowed him to spy on female guests, extending into an elaborate audio surveillance system that included hidden microphones strategically placed throughout the house and connected directly to his personal den. This sophisticated eavesdropping network allowed Flynn and his drinking buddies to listen in on private conversations between women who had no idea their most intimate discussions were being broadcast to a room full of men who were treating their personal secrets as entertainment. The microphone system was particularly invasive because it captured not just casual conversations, but also deeply personal discussions that women might have while they thought they were alone, or speaking privately with other female friends. Flynn had designed the audio setup so that he could flip a switch in his den and instantly tune into conversations happening in bathrooms, bedrooms, and other areas of the house where guests would naturally assume they had complete privacy. This electronic surveillance operation turned Flynn's legendary Hollywood parties into something much more sinister than simple hedonistic gatherings, as unsuspecting female guests were essentially being used as unwilling performers in Flynn's twisted entertainment system. The hidden microphones meant that women couldn't escape Flynn's voyeuristic attention even when they were fully clothed and simply talking with friends, since their private conversations were still being monitored and broadcast for the amusement of Flynn and whatever male companions happened to be gathered in his den at the time. The combination of visual spying through mirrors and peepholes with audio surveillance through hidden microphones created a comprehensive invasion of privacy that went far beyond what even Flynn's closest Hollywood friends might have expected. This elaborate surveillance system demonstrated that Flynn's obsession with controlling and observing women extended to every possible aspect of their behavior while they were guests in his home, creating an environment where female visitors had virtually no privacy or personal space that wasn't being monitored in some way. Fact 14. Claimed 15th cousin to Robin Hood co-star. In one of the most remarkable coincidences in Hollywood casting history, genealogical research has revealed that Errol Flynn was allegedly the 15th cousin twice removed of Olivia de Havilland, the actress who played Maid Marian opposite his Robin Hood in The Adventures of Robin Hood, and appeared as his romantic interest in 7 other films throughout their careers. This distant family connection meant that Flynn and de Havilland were actually related through their shared English ancestry, though the relationship was so distant that neither actor was aware of it during their years of working together at Warner Brothers Studios. The genealogical connection traces back through centuries of English noble lineage, with both Flynn and de Havilland descending from aristocratic families that had intermarried among the British upper classes over many generations. Flynn's family tree shows connections to various English lords and nobles, while de Havilland's ancestry includes similar aristocratic bloodlines that eventually intersected with Flynn's family several centuries before either actor was born. This family relationship adds an intriguing layer to their famous on-screen chemistry, as Flynn and de Havilland were widely considered one of Hollywood's most romantic and convincing couples during the golden age of cinema. Their 8 films together, including classics like Captain Blood, The Charge of the Light Brigade, and They Died with Their Boots On, showcased a natural rapport and romantic tension that audiences found irresistible. The fact that they were distant cousins also makes their professional relationship even more interesting, since de Havilland was one of the few leading ladies who managed to maintain a purely professional relationship with Flynn, despite his notorious reputation for pursuing his co-stars. While Flynn was famous for his romantic entanglements with many of the women he worked with, de Havilland kept their relationship strictly business, which might have been influenced by some unconscious recognition of their shared family heritage, even though the genealogical connection wasn't discovered until decades after their film careers had ended. Fact 15. Wanted autobiography titled In Like Me. When Errol Flynn decided to write his autobiography in the late 1950s, he originally wanted to title the book In Like Me, as a direct reference to the famous phrase, "in like Flynn," that had become part of American slang thanks to his legendary reputation for seducing women and getting out of difficult situations. The expression "in like Flynn" had emerged during Flynn's heyday in the 1930s and 40s, used to describe someone who was successful with romantic conquests or who could charm their way into any situation, making it a perfect reflection of how Flynn saw himself and wanted to be remembered by the public. Flynn was particularly fond of this phrase because it captured both his sexual prowess and his ability to talk his way out of trouble, 2 characteristics that had defined his public persona throughout his Hollywood career. The proposed title In Like Me would have been Flynn's way of claiming ownership of the famous saying, while also suggesting that readers could learn his secrets for achieving similar success with women and in life, generally. However, Flynn's publishers at Putnam were much more conservative than the aging actor and firmly rejected his preferred title, insisting instead on the more respectable but still suggestive My Wicked Ways. The publishers felt that In Like Me was too crude and sexually explicit for a mainstream autobiography, even one written by someone as notorious as Flynn, and they worried that the title would limit the book's commercial appeal to bookstores and libraries that might refuse to stock something so obviously focused on sexual conquest. The final title, My Wicked Ways, proved to be a wise commercial decision, as the book became a bestseller when it was published posthumously in 1959, just weeks after Flynn's death from a heart attack in Vancouver. The autobiography revealed Flynn's remarkably candid and often wildly inaccurate stories about his adventures around the world, but the more diplomatic title helped ensure that it reached a wider audience than Flynn's original choice would have allowed.